All right. So in this short How to 2D20 episode, we're going to talk about zones and movement. I have found that once people get their head around zones, movement, and distance in 2D20, the vast majority of people tend to like it, that I've seen at least. But let's go ahead and nail down how these things work, because there's a foundation here that is radically different than the vast majority of games, like your conventional take on distance.
It's weird because I never had an issue with this because zones is how I've basically been role playing for like a really long time. Very rarely will I use grids. I will just draw a little map and this bit is there and this bit is there. So zones do not have objective distances. They're not measured in meters or feet or anything else. If you imagine there's a room, okay, so there's some people are fighting in a room, and imagine there's a stage area. That stage area might be one zone, and then the main floor of this room might be another zone. And then there's a breakable wall, and if the wall gets smashed through, it goes into another. That might be a zone. So there's no set distance for how big a zone is. You know, a zone could be a couple of meters or yards across, or it could be much bigger than that if you were using vehicles, for example. Which is why zones is handy. You don't have to. It doesn't matter. But that's the idea of a zone. A zone is almost like a narrative area of space.
That's
and if you have a map,
that's exactly where I was going to use. A zone is a narratively distinct space. And within a zone, and let's talk about distance. The only, they don't use objective range.
Yeah.
And when you have to understand zones in order to understand range and distance, anyone within your zone is at close range.
Yes.
Anyone within reach of your character is at reach. Okay, great.
So essentially, distance-wise, we have that. We have reach is someone's in with your zone and they're literally within reach.
Correct.
So, you can touch them. You can hit them with a melee weapon. Okay, so what you can have in like a combat situation is you can have two people in the same zone, but they're not right next to each other, which is why the easiest way to think of a zone is roughly the size of a smallish or small to medium-sized room. If you're like a ballroom, you're in multiple zones.
Then. Although, and see, this is where it gets tough. The way I've described it in the past is, the zone is the room you're in. Okay. Now, how big is that room? And this is where people, especially coming from the 5e world, where they're counting squares, counting 5-foot squares. This is where things get a little dicey, and you have to ask people to lean into it and attempt to understand what it is in its own right. You say, like the room that I'm in right now, I would say is a zone. Now there is another room that is accessible through like a doorway. That's a separate zone. Now, if I were to have the total square footage of both rooms in a single space, because neither of them are that big, I would call that an individual zone. And so the key here is that it's both the size, but it's also the composition and the relationship between areas that lets you know whether you have moved into another zone. Like, for example, when my garage is a zone. My kitchen, where you get into from the garage through a doorway, is a separate zone because of the doorway. That constriction point is what separates them into two different zones, not necessarily the objective distance.
So sometimes it can be more like, it's like I said, if you've got a ballroom, that's very difficult because that can't be one zone. It's going to be too big for one zone. But then maybe, right, we're going to have the dance floor, and then, well, this table area, that's a zone. And then those two areas off to either side of it, that's also a zone. And that's where the band is, or, whatever, that's a zone as well. Right. We've got 5 zones. And in that case, it'd be easy. You kind of got the middle and then, north, south, east, west or something. So sometimes it either needs to be described or it needs to be shown on a map, but they don't need set distances. That's not important. Now that's what a zone is. Now, in terms of movement, then it's relatively straightforward. You can move within your zone, which means if you're not within reach, you can move so you are within reach of the same zone, easy enough. And then the next zone, we always call that medium. So most of the games you can have move to the next zone with just an action. You have a movement.
A minor action. Yeah, that's the norm.
And that's a medium range is 1 zone away. And then we have a long range, which is straightforwardly 2 zones away.
There you go.
And that usually requires you to use like, you know, a bigger action or use some amount, whatever, depending on the system.
We don't need to get into the specifics of it because in different games, sometimes it can be a little bit different. But yeah, a minor action takes you to medium range, one zone over. And typically cashing in your full action, your standard action, your major action, you would then be able to move to long range.
Yeah. Now we can have extreme range, which is 3 zones. The chances are you don't tend to have that kind of range size. Part of the whole point of 2D20 of these cinematic battles, and then we usually have multiple zones, so you can, you know, Jackie Chan punches a bad guy through a window and now they're in the next zone. That's, you know, that's the thing. They're not, now you're in another zone. You know, so it's not really a bigger deal as, oh, exactly where I, and that's the point. The thing about zones, it's meant to be quick and interactive and fun. We need to know what's in a zone so we can interact with the stuff that's in that zone. And we need to know, you know, if the bad guys start in another room and you start in this room, how easy it is to get through it.
Yeah.
But we're not counting squares here. We haven't got rules about, you know, blocking other people off. It's meant to be narrative and fitting into the system. And if you want to do cool stuff, you can. You know, one of the things that always annoys me in sort of your grid-based things. Oh, I want to go interact with it. Oh, well, I haven't really got rules that lets you interact with the scenery. I'm going to have to make it up. Well, at that point, all of the clever, fancy, precise rules don't really work. So 2D20 is a lot easier. Go, yeah, cool. Do this cool rule, or we'll put it all together. And yeah, and plenty of other systems do it. If you've ever played Theatre of the Mind, chances are you've had to break up a big area into smaller areas anyway. And that's all zones are really doing.
Yeah. One piece of advice I'll give about that, the idea of like using a map. Like if you do have a map, or you have let's say you're using miniatures, but you don't have a grid. Okay, you don't have like those piezo flip map things that you can draw on and erase really quickly that have the handy grid right there. On the one hand, those things are useful, but on the other hand, then they encourage people to start counting.
Yeah.
And the challenge with that then is people want to know, and I run into this all the time, whether I have one of those maps or whether I'm just using miniatures and there is no grid. People want to know, well, where's this zone and where's that zone? Something that's really important to remember is that on the one hand, like if you were to look at, you know, you put together like a forest glade. How's that? Forest glade, and there's a stream, and there's like some tumble down ruins in the trees off to the side of the glade. You could say, look, the glade is a zone. All right.
Yeah.
The area right around the ruins on this side's a zone. On this side of the stream is a zone. On the other side of the stream is a zone. But something to remember is that zones aren't static, because their limits and the possibilities that go with them will change based on where the characters are and what they're doing. So don't get so wedded down like or tied to the idea that like this is like always you're going to be able to draw the zones out and that they don't change, especially when you're talking about range being relative to the player in question, or the character in question. One thing I did, and I'll put together a really short video just showing this, just with my hands and file cards. I have at times used 3x5 cards, where you put down one 3x5 card and you put any 3x5 cards that are touching on a side, they all count as close.
Yeah.
And then you take minis or anything representative of the characters, and any ones that are on the same card are at reach. If there's a card between them, they're at medium range. I'll put this together in a video and I'll make sense of it. That actually can help, because then everyone, I mean, Theater of the Mind is terrific, but people can get lost in Theater of the Mind. That can cause headaches.
Yeah, my advice to zones are really straightforward. Have a really basic drawing of the thing, and then just quickly subdivide it into zones and just get on with it. And don't worry about the minutiae of how far you can move. It's once you get playing, it's much, much easier.
Yeah, and don't get bogged down in, well, my character's at the edge of this zone and yours is on the edge. I mean, unless it's something like my character is in the loft above you, well, that's different. But if you're right at the edge of the woods and the other one is at the other edge, just count them as being in the same, like break the line there. Yeah.
And there we go. So
there we go.
That's how to zone. So don't forget to like and subscribe and comment.
Yeah, like, subscribe, comment, and ideas that you have for communicating not only this approach to distance and movement, but also tips that you've used to to use these things at the table. Share those. We would appreciate it. And there you have it.